Something happened in your yard today and you probably missed it. One moment there was sound everywhere. Cardinals calling from the fence, chickadees moving through the shrubs, robins pulling worms from the lawn. The ordinary, constant noise of a yard full of life. And then, without warning, it stopped. Every bird went silent at exactly the same moment. The feeder was suddenly empty. The branches were still. And if you were paying attention, you felt something you couldn't quite name. A heaviness, a wrongness, like the yard itself was holding its breath. Most people notice this and then forget it within seconds. They assume the birds flew off for some random reason and they move on. What they don't realize is that they just witnessed one of the most sophisticated communication events in the natural world. A coordinated, species-wide alarm response that has been refined by evolution over millions of years. And what triggered it is almost certainly not what you think. Welcome back to Backyard Bird Mind. Subscribe if you haven't already, because today we're going deep into the science of bird silence. What it means, what causes it, how birds coordinate it without any visible signal, and what the research tells us about the level of environmental awareness these animals are running at every single moment they are in your yard. Stay with me to the end, because the final cause of sudden bird silence is the one that most people never consider, and it is the one that reveals something profound about the relationship between birds and the landscape they share with us. To understand why all the birds go silent at once, you first have to understand what bird sound actually is. Most people think of bird calls as communication between birds of the same species. A cardinal calling to another cardinal, a chickadee warning other chickadees. And that is part of it. But the soundscape of a healthy backyard is something far more complex than species-specific communication. It is a shared information network, a constantly updated, multi-species broadcast of environmental conditions. Researchers call this the acoustic community, and it operates according to rules that every bird in the yard has been evolutionarily programmed to understand, regardless of species. The cardinal, the chickadee, the robin, and the sparrow do not speak the same language, but they all understand the same silence. The research that established this came primarily from work on what scientists call heterospecific eavesdropping, the discovery that birds routinely monitor the alarm calls of other species and respond to them as if they were their own. A study published in the journal Behavioral Ecology demonstrated that when a small passerine bird produced a high-pitched aerial predator alarm call, every other bird species within earshot responded with immediate flight or freezing behavior, regardless of whether that call type existed in their own species repertoire. They were not responding to a familiar signal. They were responding to the information content of an unfamiliar signal, because the information was relevant to their survival. But here is where it gets more sophisticated. The silence itself is a signal. When all ambient bird sounds stop simultaneously, that cessation carries more information than any individual call could. It communicates urgency, proximity, and severity in a way that a single alarm call cannot. A single alarm call says, "There is a threat." The sudden removal of all sound says, "The threat is here, it is close." And every individual in this space has independently assessed it as serious enough to stop everything. That collective silence is the loudest alarm in nature. The first and most obvious cause of sudden, total bird silence is an aerial predator. A hawk, a falcon, or an owl moving through or over the yard triggers an immediate and total acoustic shutdown. And the mechanism behind this is one of the most elegant, evolutionary adaptations in avian biology. Many small songbirds produce what researchers call seat calls when they detect an aerial predator. These are extremely high-pitched, narrow bandwidth vocalizations that are acoustically very difficult to localize. They carry information to other birds, but give almost no directional information to the predator. They say, "Danger above," without revealing where the warning came from. But when the threat is close enough and serious enough, even these subtle calls stop. The birds shift from warning to pure concealment. No sound, no movement, complete stillness. Because in the presence of a hawk at close range, any sound or movement is a potential death sentence. Research from the University of Montana tracked hawk flight paths through suburban areas and simultaneously monitored the acoustic activity of songbird communities along those paths. The result was a precise and measurable wave of silence that preceded the hawk's visual arrival in any given area. The birds knew the hawk was coming before they could see it. They knew because the birds ahead of them in the hawk's path had already gone silent, and that wave of silence moved through the acoustic community faster than the hawk itself. What you experience when all the birds go quiet at once is often not the moment the hawk arrives in your yard. It is the moment the silence wave reaches you, transmitted bird by bird from wherever the hawk first appeared, potentially hundreds of meters away. The second cause is a ground predator, and the acoustic response to a ground predator is different in a revealing way. When a cat, a fox, a raccoon, or an off-leash dog enters or approaches the yard, the silence is often preceded by a different type of alarm. Many species produce a specific mobbing call when they detect a ground-based threat. Chickadees are particularly well studied in this regard. Research from Simon Fraser University showed that chickadees encode remarkably specific information in their mobbing calls. The number of D notes at the end of their chickadee call varies with the size and threat level of the predator. A small, highly maneuverable predator like a pygmy owl receives more D notes than a large, slow predator like a great horned owl, because the small predator is actually more dangerous to a small bird despite its size. The other birds in the yard, including species that don't produce this call themselves, decode this information and adjust their response accordingly. When the ground predator is close enough to trigger genuine flight risk, the mobbing calls stop and the silence begins. But unlike the aerial predator silence, which tends to be total and immediate, the ground predator silence often develops more gradually. You might notice the yard becoming quieter over the course of a minute or two as more birds detect the threat and shift from alarm calling to concealment. If you have ever watched your yard go progressively quieter while a neighborhood cat moves along your fence line, this is what you are witnessing. The third cause of sudden bird silence is weather, and specifically the atmospheric changes that precede a storm. This is one of the most documented and least understood phenomena in avian behavior. Birds detect approaching storms through changes in barometric pressure that occur well before any visual or auditory storm cues are available to human senses. Research published in PLOS One tracked golden-winged warblers that abandoned their nesting territory in Tennessee 24 hours before a major tornado outbreak. The birds flew hundreds of miles south to avoid the storm, then returned when it passed. The lead researcher estimated that the birds detected the infrasound produced by the storm system when it was still over 1,000 miles away. In your backyard, the response to approaching severe weather is less dramatic but follows the same principle. Birds begin to feed intensively and then stop abruptly as the barometric pressure drops below a certain threshold. The silence that follows is not alarm silence. It is shelter silence. The birds have moved into dense vegetation, low to the ground, where they will wait out the storm. If you have ever noticed that your yard goes completely quiet an hour or two before a storm arrives, and then the birds return immediately after it passes, you have observed barometric pressure sensitivity in real time. The birds knew before you did. They knew before your weather app did. The fourth cause is human activity, and this one is the most important for understanding your relationship with the birds in your yard. Certain types of human behavior trigger the same silence response as a predator, specifically sudden movements, loud sounds, and unpredictable behavior patterns. If you slam a door, shout, run across the yard, or perform any action that falls outside the established behavioral norms the birds have learned to expect from you, the yard will go silent. Not because the birds think you are a hawk, but because unpredictability and threat are equivalent in the avian risk assessment system. An unfamiliar human, or a familiar human behaving unfamiliarly, triggers the same neural circuits as predator detection. But here's the more subtle version of this, and the one that most people never connect to their own behavior. If you have been inconsistent in your yard over a period of weeks or months, if you have mixed periods of calm, predictable activity with periods of sudden, unpredictable behavior, the birds in your yard may have a persistently elevated baseline of vigilance. They are not relaxed between alarm events. They are waiting for the next one. And in a yard where the baseline vigilance is high, the threshold for triggering a full silence response is lower. The birds go quiet more easily, for longer, in response to smaller stimuli. You may have trained your yard to be more fearful than it needs to be, and you may not even know you did it. The fifth cause is the one that researchers have only recently begun to document systematically, and it is the one that reframes everything else: silence as communication. Not silence as the absence of communication. Silence as an active, intentional signal. There is growing evidence that some bird species use deliberate silence as part of their behavioral repertoire in ways that go beyond simple predator avoidance. Corvids, in particular, have been observed producing what researchers describe as strategic silence in social contexts. They go quiet not because they are afraid, but because silence gives them an information advantage. A silent bird is a bird that is listening. And in a complex social environment, listening is sometimes more valuable than broadcasting. In your yard, this means that the silence you observe is not always fear. Sometimes it is attention. Sometimes the birds have gone quiet because something new has appeared in the environment, and they are running a collective assessment, gathering information before deciding how to respond. The silence in these cases often resolves not into flight, but into a gradual resumption of normal activity, sometimes accompanied by a few soft contact calls as individual birds communicate that the situation has been assessed and the threat level is low. If you have ever watched your yard go silent and then slowly come back to life without any obvious predator having appeared, you may have witnessed this collective assessment process. What all of this tells us is that the silence in your yard is never random. Every instance of sudden, total bird silence is the output of a real-time, multi-species, distributed information processing system that is running continuously in the background of everything you think of as normal backyard activity. The birds are not just living in your yard. They are monitoring it, they are processing it, they are sharing information about it with each other across species lines. And the silence is their most powerful signal. Not the absence of communication, but the purest form of it. The next time your yard goes quiet, stop what you are doing. Look up before you look around. Check the fence line and the roof edges. Notice how the silence feels different depending on whether it is sudden and total or gradual and partial. Listen for what comes after, because the silence will always break in a way that tells you something, if you know how to hear it. A single sharp alarm call breaking the silence means the threat has moved or been identified. A gradual resumption of soft contact calls means the assessment is complete and the yard is safe. A prolonged total silence that lasts more than a few minutes means something is still out there, still close, still being watched. The birds in your yard are telling you everything that is happening in your environment. They have been doing it every day. Most of us just never learn to listen. If you have ever noticed your yard go silent and later discovered what caused it, tell me in the comments. What was it? And how long did the silence last? Subscribe if you want to keep learning what the birds in your yard are actually telling you. I'll see you in the next one.